Why was everyone ignoring her at the briefing table? It wasn't new. She learned to live with the silence, the way conversations thinned out when she entered a room, the subtle glances that measured her, tested her, dismissed her. Lieutenant Bryn Takakota had worn that silence like a second uniform. She didn't fight it anymore. Silence, she'd learned, could protect you just as much as armor. That night the mess hall smelled of burnt coffee and disinfectant. The hum of conversation and the clatter of trays echoed off the steel walls, blending into a low, constant noise that reminded her of static on an old radio. She just finished a 12-hour day shuffling between operations briefings and liaison calls with joint task force elements. Paperwork, the kind of work nobody wanted but everyone needed. The kind that made you forget, for a moment, what you trained for. She'd been back stateside for 8 months now. 8 long, quiet months at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado, the same base where her journey began years ago. She walked these same corridors as a trainee once, skin raw from salt water, eyes burning from sleepless nights, lungs clawing for air during surf torture. Back then her name wasn't whispered in curiosity. Back then she was just another candidate, another body in the sand. Now she was an officer, a liaison between SEAL teams and joint commands. It was an important job, but not the one that made her heart race, not the one that gave meaning to the scars she still carried under her uniform. She pushed through the chow line, tray in hand, nodding at the galley staff who didn't bother with rank or formality. Her plate was simple: chicken, rice, vegetables. Her appetite wasn't what it used to be. Sleep had been worse lately too. The kind of restless half-sleep that left her mind running missions that had ended years ago. When she found a quiet table in the corner, she exhaled softly, grateful for the solitude. She preferred corners, the kind of places where no one could sneak up behind her. Old habits. But that night the quiet didn't last. 5 voices entered the room like a gust of arrogance. Young, loud, restless. Bud's candidates. She knew the type before she even looked. Fresh cuts on their hairlines, shoulders broad with youth, eyes hungry for validation. They had the look of men who hadn't yet learned what humility costs. One of them noticed her. Maybe it was the way she sat, posture straight, gaze low, unbothered. Or maybe it was the quiet confidence that made insecure men itch. He said something she didn't catch and the others laughed. She ignored it. She learned to ignore things. But they kept looking. Then, with that kind of reckless energy only the untested have, they started walking toward her. The tallest one, shaved head, broad chest, the kind of kid who believed pain only happened to other people, stopped in front of her table. He leaned slightly, blocking the light. "You lost, ma'am?" he asked, voice dripping with mock politeness. Bryn looked up, calm. "No," she said simply. The boy grinned, glancing at his buddies. "This mess is for operators, not admin staff." A small ripple of laughter. Her fork paused midair. She placed it down slowly, eyes never leaving his. "You're out of line, candidate." He tilted his head. "You don't look like an operator." There it was, the same sentence she'd heard too many times, said in too many ways. Another one, smaller but sharper-faced, leaned against the next table. "Come on, lady, don't take it personal. We're just saying you don't really have that SEAL energy." A third chuckled. "Maybe she's logistics or medical, you know, the kind that tells real operators where to stand." Their laughter was louder now. Other sailors were turning their heads. The noise in the mess hall started to fade, replaced by that prickling silence before a storm. Bryn didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. "I said," she repeated, "you're out of line." The Texan smirked and took a step closer, close enough that she could see the sheen of sweat on his jawline. "You gonna make me move?" he asked. Her pulse slowed. The world seemed to narrow, the edges of her vision tightening to a single frame: his chest, the placement of his feet, the twitch of his right hand. She'd seen this posture 100 times, not just in training, in alleys, in compounds, in war zones where hesitation meant death. But this was Syria, this was Iraq, this was home. And yet the same feeling crept in, the quiet, cold steadiness before action. Behind him, one of the recruits muttered something crude about what she was probably good for. The others laughed again. That was the moment the room went still. Somewhere deep in her chest, that old anger flickered, not loud, not wild, but focused. The kind that didn't need to be loud to burn. She stood 5'6", maybe 135 pounds. Every inch of her posture was calm, controlled, calculated. The Texan smirked again, mistaking calm for weakness. "What's wrong? Don't like jokes." Bryn's voice was steady. "You have 5 seconds to walk away." He laughed. 5 seconds to what? The others started circling, not in a coordinated way, but with that pack mentality that makes stupidity contagious. Someone said, "Let's teach her some respect." Bryn's hand came up before the sentence finished. A quick, precise motion, a blur of movement and breath. The first recruit didn't even see it coming. Her palm snapped his wrist away, and her elbow drove straight into his solar plexus. The air rushed out of his lungs with a sound halfway between a gasp and a grunt. The Texan moved next, lunging forward. She sidestepped, guiding his momentum past her, swept her leg low, and watched gravity finish the job. His back hit the tile with a solid, satisfying thud. Another grabbed her from behind. Bad mistake. She dropped her weight, twisted her hips, and drove her knee sideways into the nerve cluster near his fibular head. He folded instantly, collapsing with a strangled cry. The fourth one froze. The fifth backed away entirely. All of it took maybe 30 seconds. She stood still, chest rising and falling in controlled rhythm. Around her, the mess hall was dead silent. You could hear the hum of the lights, the faint buzz of a refrigerator in the distance. The Texan looked up from the floor, confusion painted across his face. His arrogance had evaporated, replaced by disbelief. Bryn met his eyes. "You ever disrespect another service member like that again," she said quietly, "the next lesson won't be this gentle." No yelling, no anger, just the kind of certainty that leaves no room for argument. Then came the voice from the serving line. "That's enough." Senior Chief Garrett Moss, 12 years as a Bud S instructor, his face lined from too many nights watching candidates break in the surf. He stepped forward, gaze calm, unreadable. He looked at the recruits, then at Bryn. "What's your rank in community, Lieutenant?" he asked evenly. "Naval Special Warfare," she said. "SEAL." "Yes, Chief." Something flickered behind his eyes, not surprise, not disbelief. Recognition. "Name?" "Takakoda, Bryn Takakoda." He nodded slowly. "I remember that name." He turned to the recruits, voice suddenly razor-sharp. "You 5 command duty office. 5 minutes. Move." They scrambled up, avoiding her eyes. The mess hall stayed quiet until the door closed behind them. Moss turned back to her. "You okay, Lieutenant?" She nodded once. "I'm fine." He studied her for a moment. "I was there when your class graduated," he said finally. "Didn't think I'd see you again like this." Her expression didn't change. "Neither did I." He gave a small nod, not pity, not apology, respect. Then he said quietly, "It won't happen again." When he left, Bryn sat back down, hands trembling slightly under the table. Not from fear, from restraint. From holding back the part of herself that wanted to disappear again. She picked up her fork. The food was cold. The whispers started again, low and scattered. Words like "SEAL, Lieutenant, that's her." They didn't bother her, not anymore. That night back in her quarters, she sat by the window overlooking the bay. The city lights reflected on the dark water, broken by the ripples of passing boats. She touched the small gold trident pinned in the velvet box inside her drawer, the one she hadn't worn since her second deployment. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her head. "Respect isn't given, girl, it's earned," quietly. He taught her that on the Colville reservation, when she was barely old enough to hold a rifle. He never talked much about Vietnam, just the woods, the silence, the way wind carried sound. He told her that patience was the deadliest weapon she could ever learn. She carried those lessons into every moment of her life, through the freezing surf of Bud S., the darkness of Syrian nights, the quiet halls of this base. Now, though, for the first time in a long time, she wondered if hiding her strength had protected her, or isolated her. Because tonight, for all the chaos, something inside her had shifted. Not pride, not anger. Something closer to peace. Sometimes silence doesn't protect you. Sometimes it just keeps others from knowing who you are. And for the first time since she'd come home, Bryn Takakota wasn't sure she wanted to stay invisible anymore. The morning came slow, heavy with that coastal chill that slipped through the cracks of the barracks windows. Coronado was quiet at dawn. You could smell the salt in the air, the faint sting of jet fuel from the nearby tarmac. Bryn hadn't slept much. Her dreams had been fragments again, pieces of places she tried to forget. The sound of rotor blades, the flash of light in a narrow Syrian alley, a voice shouting contact left. Then silence. When she opened her eyes, the ceiling above her was pale gray. She watched it for a long moment, counting her breaths the way her grandfather had taught her, in fours, steady, calm. Breathe in, hold, release. Control what you can. By the time she walked across the compound toward the command offices, the sun was just starting to rise, painting the sky in thin bands of orange. Sailors passed her, nodding quick greetings, some pretending not to recognize her. Word had already spread about the mess hall. News like that traveled faster than orders. She didn't care, not outwardly anyway. But deep down, a small voice asked, had she gone too far? She replayed it in her mind, the laughter, the words, the look in that Texan's eyes before he hit the floor. She'd controlled her force. She hadn't broken bones. She'd done what was necessary, nothing more. But still, she knew how stories twisted. She'd seen it before. A woman reacts and suddenly the story isn't about the provocation, it's about her temper, her aggression. She squared her shoulders as she reached the office door marked Commanding Officer, SEAL Team 7. She paused, took one last breath and knocked. Enter. Commander Eric Dalton looked up from behind his desk. He was mid-40s, tall, precise, a man who carried authority the way others carried fatigue, naturally. Beside him stood Senior Chief Moss, hands folded behind his back. Lieutenant Takakota, Dalton said, motioning to the chair across from him. Have a seat. She did. Dalton leaned back slightly, eyes steady. You were involved in an altercation in the mess hall last night. Yes, sir. I've reviewed statements from multiple witnesses, he said. 5 Bud S candidates approached you, made inappropriate comments, and attempted to engage physically. You responded with controlled defensive action. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. 2 of them sustained minor injuries, he continued. They were treated and released. All 5 have been formally counseled, and 2 are being dropped from training for conduct unbecoming. Bryn stayed quiet. Dalton glanced down at a file, flipping through the pages. I also noticed something interesting, Lieutenant. You arrived at Coronado 8 months ago, assigned as a liaison officer to Naval Special Warfare Command. But your record here doesn't indicate your SEAL qualification. Bryn met his eyes. That's correct, sir. Why not? She hesitated. There wasn't a right answer, not really. I wanted to do my job, she said finally, without the extra attention. Moss shifted slightly but said nothing. Dalton studied her. Lieutenant, what you did last night, I've heard stories like that before, but usually they don't end with restraint. You handled it cleanly, professionally. You didn't escalate when you could have. That tells me something about who you are. Bryn nodded once, unsure if he expected a reply. Dalton's tone softened. You've earned that trident, you shouldn't have to hide it, you understand that. She looked down. Her hands rested on her knees, fingers interlaced. Respectfully, sir, some people don't see it that way. Moss spoke up then, voice low but firm. She's right, Commander. Some still think the pipeline's different, easier. They don't know what the women who made it through went through. Dalton nodded slowly. Well, I do, and I've read your record, Lieutenant. Syria, Iraq, advisory missions under fire. You've been recommended for a Bronze Star for your actions in the Derizer province. Bryn blinked. I didn't know that recommendation went through. It did, Dalton said. And it says here your leadership under contact prevented further casualties. That's not small. She stayed silent. Compliments made her uneasy. Praise always felt like the first half of a trap. Dalton closed the folder. Chief Moss and I have discussed your situation. Frankly, I think you're wasted behind a desk. The community needs operators who can handle themselves and who understand what it means to stay composed when it counts. He leaned forward slightly. Would you be open to rejoining an operational team? The room went still. She hadn't expected that. For 8 months, she'd convinced herself that this quiet life was what she wanted: reports, briefings, paperwork, safe distance from the noise of combat. But sitting there, she realized she'd been lying to herself. Her chest tightened, not from fear, from something that felt a lot like relief. Yes, sir, she said softly, I would. Dalton smiled just slightly. Good. We'll start the paperwork. Expect reassignment within 6 weeks. I'll speak with Team 3's co-personally. They're standing up a new element for Horn of Africa operations. They could use your skill set. He stood, extending his hand. Welcome back to the fight, Lieutenant. She rose and shook his hand firmly. Thank you, sir. When she left the office, the sunlight outside hit her face like warmth she hadn't felt in years. She didn't smile, but something inside her eased. Moss followed her out into the corridor. Lieutenant, he said. She turned. You did good last night. You didn't let them pull you down to their level. She met his eyes. I wasn't angry, Chief, just tired. He gave a small nod. Tired's fine. It means you've lasted long enough to feel it. She almost smiled, almost. As he walked away, she stood there for a moment, listening to the faint hum of air conditioning through the vents, the echo of boots in the hall. Then she turned toward the pier. Outside, the ocean glittered in the distance. Training boats moved across the bay like shadows. For years, that horizon had meant something to her: challenge, belonging, purpose. Somewhere along the line, it had turned into routine. But now, for the first time in a long time, it looked alive again. That night she packed her gear. She didn't know where she'd be sent yet, but the ritual felt grounding, the way folding a uniform always did. Order in a world that rarely gave it. Her hand brushed against a photo taped inside her locker, her and her brother on the reservation, ages ago. He'd been maybe 10, holding a slingshot. She'd been 15, already trying to look like she didn't care about anything. Their grandfather stood behind them in his old Marine jacket, face hard but proud. She remembered the smell of pine and rain, the crunch of dry leaves under boots. He taught her everything that mattered before she even knew what it meant: patience, discipline, stillness. Don't rush the shot, Bryn. Breathe first. Feel where the wind goes. She thought those lessons were about hunting. Later, she learned they were about life. The next weeks passed in quiet preparation. She didn't announce her reassignment. The fewer people who knew, the better. Still, whispers moved through the base, the story of the woman who dropped 5 candidates without breaking stride. Some called her a legend. Some called her trouble. She ignored both. When the orders finally came, SEAL Team 3, Detachment Alpha, Horn of Africa Operations, she felt a calm she hadn't felt in months. Rejoining an operational team wasn't about proving anything anymore. It was about belonging again. Her first day with Team 3 felt like stepping into an old photograph. The smell of oil and metal, the bark of instructors on the range, the subtle tension in the air that only existed where danger was routine. The men watched her carefully, some curious, some cautious. One or two openly skeptical. That was fine. She didn't need their approval. She just needed time. She spent the next 3 weeks training with them. Weapons drills, insertion simulations, small unit tactics refreshers. Every movement, every detail measured and precise. She didn't speak much. She didn't have to. By the end of the month, the jokes had stopped. The doubts had softened. Respect, she remembered, isn't granted. It's built, one quiet action at a time. The deployment came sooner than expected. Southern Somalia. Counter-terrorism support. Limited footprint, high risk. Bryn was assigned as assistant patrol leader, second in command to Lieutenant Commander Ramirez, a veteran of multiple deployments. It was supposed to be routine target capture, quick in and out. But nothing in war is ever routine. The team landed in-country under moonless skies. The humidity was suffocating, the air thick with dust and diesel. The mission brief was simple: locate and detain a high-value individual responsible for coordinating attacks on coalition supply routes. Bryn's unit moved out before dawn. The target compound sat on the edge of a dry riverbed, surrounded by low mud walls and a scattering of trees. Intel suggested minimal resistance. But Intel, she knew, had a habit of lying. They breached before sunrise. The entry went clean. 2 detainees secured, no shots fired. For a brief moment it felt textbook. Then the radio crackled. Movement north, multiple technicals inbound. Bryn didn't hesitate. All stations set defense, weapons free on PID. The first burst of machine gun fire tore through the quiet like lightning. Dust erupted around them as rounds struck the compound walls. Someone shouted for cover. Bryn dropped behind a corner, raised her rifle and scanned. She saw the truck first, 50 cal mounted, firing in short, brutal bursts. She keyed her mic. "Ramirez, we've got a 50 up north, range 70 meters, I can mark it." "Do it," came his reply. She leaned out, squeezed off controlled shots, tagging the vehicle's front end. The driver slumped forward. The gunner swung the barrel toward her position, but before he could fire, Ramirez's team engaged from the flank. The fight lasted 4 minutes. When it was over, the smell of cordite and burned oil filled the air. Ramirez looked at her, panting slightly. "You kept your head, Lieutenant. You saved us time, probably lives." Bryn nodded once, her voice calm. "Just doing my job, sir." But inside, something stirred, not pride exactly. Something quieter. The feeling of being exactly where she was meant to be. Later, when they returned to base, the team was different around her. The doubt was gone. The tone had changed. She wasn't the woman who'd earned the trident anymore. She was the operator who'd earned their trust. That night she sat outside her tent, looking up at a sky filled with strange constellations. The stars here felt sharper, more honest. She thought of her grandfather again. "You have the hands for it," he'd said once, long before she understood what it meant. Maybe this was what he'd seen in her all along, not strength, not aggression, but steadiness. And maybe, finally, she was ready to believe it too. Why did she always wake before dawn, even when there was no mission? Old conditioning, maybe. Or ghosts. The kind that never bothered to knock, they just showed up, uninvited, bringing pieces of the past with them. Somalia was behind her now, but the sand still clung to her boots. The mission had gone well. Official reports used words like effective coordination and exceptional composure under fire. The kind of phrases that looked good in citations, but meant very little to the people who'd been there. Her team had returned to Coronado 6 weeks ago. The first days home were a blur, debriefs, paperwork, the usual post-deployment haze. Then came the silence, the kind that pressed against your ribs until breathing felt like effort. Some nights she'd sit on the pier, listening to the Pacific. It was nothing like the desert wind, but it carried the same kind of loneliness. Her brother called once a week. He Ask if she was eating right, if she'd thought about taking leave, maybe coming home to Washington for a while. She, tell him she was fine, that she had too much to do. He didn't argue, just sighed and said, "Okay, Bryn." She'd hang up and stare at the trident on her desk, wondering when fine became her favorite lie. That morning she found herself walking toward the training range before sunrise. The sky was the color of wet steel, the kind of gray that promised rain. She signed out an MK-18 from the armory and stepped into the cold air. The range was empty. Good. She liked it that way. Every movement was muscle memory. Check the chamber, load, shoulder, breathe, squeeze. Brass casings clattered on concrete, sharp and rhythmic. Each shot felt like punctuation in a sentence she didn't have words for. Somewhere behind the rhythm, memories began to surface. Syria, 2023. The smell came first, diesel, dust, and something metallic. Her advisory team had been embedded with Kurdish partners in the Derizer province. The mission was simple on paper: train, advise, and assist local units fighting the last pockets of ISIS resistance. But paper never bled. It had been late afternoon, the sky the color of ash. Her team was returning from a patrol when the radio crackled with reports of enemy movement near a nearby compound. They moved to investigate: 5 operators, 1 interpreter, 3 Kurdish fighters. The compound looked abandoned. Bryn was point. She moved through a narrow alley, rifle raised, heart steady. Then the air split open, the dry, crackling sound of AK fire. Rounds tore into the wall inches from her head. She dropped instantly, instinct taking over. Her breath slowed, her world narrowing to angles, shadows, and sound. "Contact rooftop," she shouted. The team fanned out, returning fire. Dust filled the air. The radio screamed. Someone called for air support, but the nearest bird was 20 minutes out. She peeked around the corner, spotted movement, a muzzle flash behind a crumbling parapet. One deep breath, one squeeze, the figure dropped. Then another, then silence. When it was over, she realized her hands weren't shaking. They never did. That scared her more than the gunfire. Later that night, Ramirez, her team leader, pulled her aside. "You handled that like a pro, Takakota. You just saved our asses." She nodded, said nothing. But lying awake later, she'd stared at the ceiling of the makeshift barracks, wondering when calm under fire stopped feeling like control and started feeling like numbness. The medal recommendation came a week later, a Bronze Star for valor. She hadn't told her family. She didn't want congratulations for surviving what others didn't. Back on the range, another casing hit the ground and rolled toward her boot. She stared at it for a long moment before ejecting the magazine and setting the rifle down. The echo of the last shot hung in the air, fatting slowly. She rubbed her temples. You can't outshoot memory, she thought. Later that afternoon, she walked past the command building, heading for the docks. The wind had picked up, pushing small waves against the pilings. She saw Moss standing near the edge, talking with a young petty officer. When he noticed her, he waved the junior sailor off. "Lieutenant," he said as she approached, "heard you've been living on the range again." She managed a half-smile. "Old habits, Chief." He nodded. "Old habits keep us alive until they don't." They stood in silence for a moment, watching gulls circle the water. Moss's voice softened. "You ever think about what's next?" Bryn shrugged. "Next deployment, maybe." He shook his head. "Not the job, you." She didn't answer. He sighed. "You know, I watched a lot of good operators burn out trying to prove they belonged. Men, women, doesn't matter. The job eats everyone the same way. The trick isn't surviving it, it's finding what's left of you after." His words stayed with her long after he left. That night she drove to the beach just outside the base. The sand was cold under her boots, the horizon stretching endlessly ahead. She sat down, pulled her jacket tighter, and let the sound of waves fill the spaces words couldn't reach. She thought about the first time she'd told her grandfather she wanted to join the Navy. He looked at her for a long time before speaking. "They'll try to break you," he'd said, "and maybe they will, but breaking isn't the end. It's just the part where you find out what's underneath." She smiled faintly at the memory. He never said be careful or stay safe. He just taught her to be steady. A flash of lightning far offshore caught her attention. The storm was moving in. She stood, brushing sand from her sleeves. On her way back, she passed a group of new recruits jogging along the boardwalk, their cadence calls echoing across the night. Young voices, full of certainty. It made her ache, not with envy but with understanding. They didn't know yet what the uniform really cost. The next morning, she was called into Ramirez's office. He was reviewing after-action reports from Somalia. "Take a seat," he said, not looking up. "We got the official commendation from AFRICOM. Command's impressed." "Good to hear, sir." He glanced up, a faint smile tugging at his mouth. "They're also recommending you for patrol lead on the next rotation." She blinked. "That's quick." "You earned it, but that's not why I wanted to talk." He leaned back, studying her. "You've got the calm, Bryn. The kind of calm that only comes from walking through hell and remembering how to breathe. But I also see something else: distance. You good?" She hesitated. The instinct to say fine rose again, automatic, but something about the way he asked stopped her. "I don't know," she said finally. "I don't know what good means anymore." Ramirez nodded slowly. "That's fair, just don't confuse quiet with peace. They're not the same thing." He signed the paperwork on his desk, then handed her a folded copy. "Take a few days off base. You've earned it." She wanted to protest, but something in his tone told her not to. 2 days later, she was on a flight north Seattle, then a long drive to Colville. She hadn't been home in years. The reservation hadn't changed much. Same dirt roads, same mountains standing like sentinels in the distance. She parked near the small cemetery at the edge of town. The rain started as a drizzle, then turned steady. Her grandfather's headstone was simple: SGT. James Takakota, USMC, Vietnam 1968-1970. A folded flag rested in a weatherproof case beside it, placed there by her brother months ago. She knelt, fingertips brushing the cold stone. "I got reassigned," she whispered. "Back to the teams. I think you'd like that." The rain soaked her hair, her jacket, her hands. She didn't move. "I keep thinking about what you said once, about respect being earned in silence. I used to think that meant staying invisible, but maybe it means something else. Maybe it means knowing when to stop hiding." A gust of wind scattered the pine needles around her boots. The air smelled like earth and smoke. She stood there until the clouds began to break, light spilling through in narrow shafts. Her brother's truck pulled up on the dirt road. He waved, walked over, and handed her a thermos. "Coffee," he said, "strong enough to fight the dead." She smiled faintly, unscrewing the lid. He looked at the headstone. "He'd be proud, you know." "Maybe," she said softly. "No," he insisted, "he would." They stood in silence for a while, watching the light shift across the hills. When she finally turned to leave, she tucked a small photo into the grass beside the grave, her Bud-esque graduation picture. Mud-streaked face, eyes exhausted but alive, the trident catching the sun. As she walked back toward the truck, a thought formed, clear, certain. The world didn't need her silence anymore. It needed her strength. Back in Coronado, the orders for deployment were already waiting. Why did the air always feel different before a mission, heavy, like it knew what was coming? Bryn stood on the tarmac at dawn, the wind pushing against her fatigues, carrying the scent of fuel and salt. Behind her, the base buzzed with quiet urgency, engines spooling, gear checks, voices low but focused. Ahead, a C-130 waited with its rear ramp yawning open like a dark mouth. Her team, 12 men and 1 woman, moved with practiced rhythm, loading rucks and weapons cases. No wasted motion. Every man here knew the stakes. Somalia had been a success, but this was different. Yemen. An advisory deployment officially. Off the books mostly. Their orders were clear: train local counterterrorism units, gather intelligence, and, if necessary, conduct targeted recovery operations in the Al-Mar region, one of the most unstable areas on the Arabian Peninsula. Unofficially, the whispers said something else: a hostage situation, a journalist, American, captured by a splinter faction that didn't answer to anyone. Bryn adjusted her gloves, checking the wrist knife she always kept hidden under the strap. The habit stayed with you, even when the mission names changed. Ramirez walked up beside her, his expression unreadable under the pale light. "We're wheels up in 5, he said. "You good?" "I'm fine," she answered automatically. He gave her a look, not skeptical, just knowing. "You don't have to be." She didn't reply. As the engines roared to life, she climbed aboard, the familiar vibration of the fuselage humming through her boots. She took a seat near the rear, helmet on her lap, eyes closed. For a moment she let herself drift, not asleep, but somewhere in that space between thought and memory. The reservation, the rain, her grandfather's grave, his voice again as clear as ever. "Sometimes silence is strength. Sometimes it's surrender. You'll have to learn which one you're choosing." When she opened her eyes, the plane was already lifting off, the ground falling away beneath them. The heat in Yemen hit like a wall. Even at night, the air was thick enough to taste. Their forward operating base was a converted airstrip near Al Gaida, bare bones, temporary, but secure enough for what they needed. Bryn spent the first week training local forces, teaching marksmanship, close quarters movement, night operations. She spoke little Arabic, but the language of soldiers was universal. Hand signals, nods, the shared silence before a breach. Her reputation had followed her again. Someone must have mentioned Somalia or maybe even Coronado. She could feel the curiosity in the way the men watched her, some with respect, some with uncertainty. A woman among SEALs still carried weight, even in 2025. One evening, while running drills under the fatting sun, one of the local commanders approached her. His name was Rahim, a man with deep-set eyes and hands that looked too old for his age. He asked through a translator, "Why do you fight?" The question caught her off guard. She hesitated, then said quietly, "To keep others from having to." Rahim nodded, studying her. "That is a good answer," he said, "but it is also a heavy one." She didn't argue, he was right. 2 nights later, the mission came down. Intel confirmed the presence of a high-value hostage, an American journalist named David Loring, held in a compound near the coastal village of Hadab. Extraction window, 20 minutes. Bryn was second in command, overseeing assault coordination and comms. Ramirez would lead the main entry team. She'd handle outer security and extraction route management. The plan was tight, rehearsed, but no plan ever survived first contact. They launched under cover of darkness. The convoy moved fast, 2 armored vehicles and a support truck carrying local allies. The desert wind whipped through the open doors, stinging her eyes with sand. At 200, they stopped 2 clicks short of the target, engines off, silence, the kind that made your heart amplify its own sound. Bryn checked her gear one last time, mags seated, radio secure, rifle ready. She looked at Ramirez. He nodded once. "Let's get him home," he said. They advanced on foot. The compound was quiet, too quiet. Bryn's gut tightened. She learned to trust that feeling. As they stacked on the outer wall, Ramirez whispered, 2 minutes. Bryn scanned the horizon, faint light to the east, maybe a lantern. Then movement, shadows. She keyed her mic, possible external sentries, north wall. Before Ramirez could respond, the night exploded. Gunfire ripped through the silence, tracers slicing the dark. The first rounds hit the wall inches from her shoulder. "Contact north multiple," she shouted. Chaos unfolded instantly. The team split, half moving to engage, half pushing toward the breach point. Bryn pivoted, returning controlled bursts toward the muzzle flashes. The sand kicked up around her boots, the air thick with dust and adrenaline. Ramirez were pinned. Hold position, we're breaching now. She shifted left, found better cover behind a broken wall and saw him, one of the hostiles, maybe 30 meters out, running for a firing position. She tracked him, exhaled and squeezed. One shot. He dropped. Seconds stretched. Each breath felt like minutes. Then a call crackled through her headset, package secure, moving to exfil. Bryn rallied the outer element. Fall back, cover teams got the package. They moved fast, bounding between cover, rounds snapping overhead. The vehicles were waiting, engines hot. Ramirez climbed in with the hostage, shouting over the roar, "Go, go, go." Bryn was last in the line, sprinting through dust and light. Something whistled past her ear, a sound she knew too well. She dove behind the nearest tire as the rear of the vehicle erupted in sparks. RPG. "Hit the gas," she shouted, waving them forward. The driver slammed the accelerator. The convoy lurched ahead, leaving a bloom of fire behind. Bryn climbed into the last truck, lungs burning, heart steady. They drove through the night, not stopping until the base lights appeared on the horizon. When they finally dismounted, Ramirez turned to her, eyes wide. "We almost lost it out there." Bryn wiped the sweat and grit from her face. "Almost doesn't count, sir." He laughed, short and tired. "You really don't rattle, do you?" "Only when I'm supposed to." The hostage survived. The mission was declared a success. Another line in another report, but for Bryn, something about that night stayed. Later, when the adrenaline wore off, she sat alone outside her tent, the desert wind cool against her face. The camp was quiet, generators humming in the distance, a radio playing faintly in someone's quarters. She watched the horizon, still glowing faintly from the fire they'd left behind. She thought of the man they'd rescued, pale, shaken, eyes hollow from months of captivity. He thanked her when she helped him into the truck. His voice had trembled. She nodded but couldn't find words to respond. She didn't feel heroic, just tired. A soft crunch of boots on sand pulled her from her thoughts. Ramirez appeared, holding 2 mugs of coffee. He handed her one and sat down. "You did good tonight," he said. Bryn shook her head. "Luck did." He sipped, considering. "Maybe, but luck only matters if you're ready for it. You were." They sat in silence for a long time. Then he said quietly, "You ever think about what keeps you doing this?" She stared at the dark horizon. "I used to think it was duty, then it was pride. Now I think it's just the only thing that makes sense." He nodded slowly. "That's the dangerous part, when it starts making sense." They didn't talk after that. The night didn't need more words. When she finally crawled into her cot, the world outside was starting to pale, the first light of dawn creeping over the sand. She lay there, eyes open, listening to the camp wake up. She thought of home, the reservation, the rain, the quiet of the woods. And for the first time in a long time, she wondered if there was a world for her outside this one. The kind where survival didn't have to be earned every day. The kind where silence meant peace, not aftermath. Sleep came just before sunrise, shallow, uneasy. And in that brief space between dreams and memory, she saw her grandfather again, standing in the woods, saying nothing, just looking at her, proud, maybe, or warning her. It was hard to tell. When she reached for him, he was gone. And she woke to the sound of a radio crackling with new orders. Why did the worst moments always start with silence? Not chaos, not warning, just that split second of stillness before everything breaks. Bryn felt it again, that eerie calm, as the Black Hawk lifted off from the forward strip, the rotors beating steady against the night sky. She sat near the door, watching the desert vanish beneath them, the horizon swallowed by darkness. Her team was heading back into Yemen, this time deeper inland. Intelligence reports hinted at a new insurgent stronghold forming near the Wadi Hadramawt Basin. They'd been briefed, locate, confirm, extract intel, in and out, routine by the book. But she'd learned long ago, the moment you call something routine, you invite disaster. Ramirez sat across from her, his face hidden behind night vision goggles. His hand rested loosely on his rifle. He caught her eye and gave a small nod, the kind of gesture leaders use when words feel unnecessary. She returned it, calm, collected, professional. Inside, she felt the familiar stillness. Not fear, something colder, something she'd once mistaken for control. The helicopter banked low, flying parallel to the dry riverbed. Below, the land looked lifeless, dunes and rock, and scattered ruins that time had forgotten. Then came the voice over the headset, 1 minute out. Bryn checked her gear again, more from instinct than need. Her rifle, her sidearm, the small locket tucked under her vest, her grandfather's old dog tag, worn smooth from years of touch. She never admitted it to anyone, but she rubbed it before every mission. Not for luck, for grounding. 30 seconds. She looked at the men around her. They were ready, weapons tight, minds locked in. A small team, but good. The kind that didn't need speeches to do their job. The helicopter flared. Dust exploded around them as they touched down. Go, go, go. Bryn jumped, boots hitting hard ground. The wind from the rotors whipped sand into her face as she crouched low, scanning the horizon. The night was empty, too empty. They moved fast, low silhouettes cutting through the moonlight. The target compound sat half buried in the valley ahead, broken walls, rusted gates, and an air of abandonment that screamed trap. Bryn's pulse slowed again, that premonition she could never explain. Ramirez, she whispered through comms, something's off. He paused beside her, scanning through his NVGs. You seeing movement? No, that's the problem. He nodded slightly. We're committed, we'll clear fast. They stacked on the gate. Ramirez gave the signal, breach charge, flash, entry. The first room was empty. The second, nothing but crates and dust. Then came the pop, sharp, metallic. Tripwire. Back, back. The explosion tore through the compound. Heat and dust slammed into her chest, throwing her backward. Her ears rang, the world reduced to flashes and muted roars. When the dust settled, she heard the screaming. 2 men down, 1 unmoving. Bryn crawled toward them, vision swimming. Medic, get over here. Corpsman Daniels was already there, blood streaking his cheek. He dropped beside the first man, Petty Officer First Class Hayes. The right side of his body was a ruin of shrapnel. Pulse weak, Daniels shouted. I need pressure now. Bryn pressed her hands over the wound, feeling the warmth spill through her gloves. Her throat tightened. Stay with me, Hayes, stay with me. His eyes flickered open barely. He tried to speak, but the sound was just air. Don't, she said, save your breath. Ramirez's voice came through comms, calm, controlled, forced. We're compromised. Contact inbound. All stations prepped to exfil. Bryn, status. She looked down at Hayes, then back toward the gate. We're not moving him in this condition. Ramirez hesitated. We don't have time. She clenched her jaw. Then we make time. The next 5 minutes blurred, gunfire from the ridgeline, flashes of light cutting through the dust. Bryn returned fire mechanically, every movement automatic. Somewhere in the chaos, she felt Hayes' body go still under her hands. Daniels looked at her, eyes glassy. He didn't have to say it. She froze for a second, just long enough to feel the weight of it, before grabbing Hayes, dog tag, and tucking it into her vest. Move, she shouted. They fought their way out, sprinting through the dust, bullets tracing the air behind them. The extraction bird was already inbound, engines howling through the dark. Ramirez covered the rear, everyone up. Bryn turned once, glancing back toward the burning compound. Hayes was still in there. She wanted to go back to do the impossible, but Ramirez's hand gripped her shoulder. "Don't," he said. She looked at him, saw the exhaustion, the grief, and nodded once. Then she climbed aboard the bird. When the helicopter lifted off, the world below blurred into darkness again. She sat silent, staring at the floor, her gloves still slick with blood. No one spoke, no one had to. Back at base, the debrief was short and clinical. Words like collateral damage and hostile ambush were tossed around, stripped of humanity. Afterward, Bryn walked out into the open air, needing space. The desert stretched endless before her, wind whispering through the wire fences. Ramirez found her sitting on a crate near the perimeter wall, helmet beside her. He didn't speak right away, just stood there, the silence between them heavier than words. Finally, he said quietly, "You did what you could." She didn't look up. It wasn't enough. It never is. He sat down beside her, elbows resting on his knees. "I've been where you are. The first one you lose, it stays. But if you carry it wrong, it'll drown you. And if you don't carry it at all, it'll hollow you out." She stared at the sand, her voice low. He was just a kid. Ramirez nodded. "We all were once." The wind picked up, whistling through the wires overhead. For a long time, neither of them said anything. Then, almost to herself, Bryn whispered, "I told him to cover the east wall. That's where the wire was. I should have seen it." Ramirez shook his head. "You can't see everything. That's the lie they sell us, that control means safety. Out here, control just means you know what you're about to lose." She let the words sink in. They didn't bring comfort, but they felt true. Later that night, she couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the flash, the way Hayes had looked at her, trusting she could save him. At 300, she got up and walked to the edge of camp. The stars were sharp, cold, infinite. She pulled Hayes' tag from her vest pocket, holding it in her palm. The metal was still scratched, the chain broken. She whispered his name. No ceremony, no speech, just a name carried into the wind. Then she placed the tag into the sand and pressed it down gently with her fingers. When she looked up, the horizon was turning pale, dawn creeping in. They flew back to Coronado 3 weeks later. The flight was quiet. Ramirez spent most of it reviewing reports, but his eyes kept drifting to her, worried. When they landed, Bryn stayed behind, helping unload the gear. By the time she made it to her quarters, the base was half asleep. She dropped her bag, peeled off her boots, and sat on the floor. The silence hit harder here. She looked at her reflection in the window, dark circles under her eyes, a streak of dried blood she hadn't noticed on her sleeve. She thought about writing Hayes' family. She'd done it before for others. The words were always the same: bravery, sacrifice, honor, but this time they felt hollow. Instead, she opened her drawer, took out her grandfather's dog tag, and held it beside Hayes. 2 pieces of metal, generations apart, bound by the same story, young men lost to wars that were supposed to make sense. She sat there until the first light of morning filled the room. Then she whispered, "You earned your peace, kid. The rest is on us." In the following weeks, Bryn went through the motions: briefings, medical checks, physical training. But the energy was gone. The drive that once kept her moving felt muted. During a meeting with the unit psychologist, a major named Stein, she found herself staring out the window instead of answering questions. "Lieutenant," he said gently, "you're carrying something heavy. You don't have to do it alone." She turned to him. "If I let go of it, who remembers him?" He paused, then said softly, "Remembering and reliving aren't the same thing." That night, those words echoed in her mind. She realized she didn't know which one she'd been doing. When she finally slept, she dreamed of water. Cold, clear, endless. She was sinking but not afraid, just tired. Then faintly, she heard her grandfather's voice again. "You can't save everyone, Bryn, but you can honor them by how you live after." She woke up crying quietly, for the first time in years. The next day she ran 12 miles before dawn, not to escape, to breathe again, to feel the ground under her feet, to remind herself she was still here. When she returned, sweat-soaked and exhausted, she stood at the edge of the pier, watching the sun rise over the bay. For the first time since the explosion, she whispered something to herself, a promise, not a prayer. "I'll keep walking." The wind off the water carried the words away, soft but steady. Sometimes resilience isn't loud. It doesn't roar or demand. It just breathes one quiet breath after another until grief turns into purpose again. Why did new faces always remind her of ghosts? The young ones walked the halls with the same spark in their eyes that she used to carry, that stubborn belief that courage was enough. Bryn Takakota could spot it instantly, the mix of pride and fear that lived in every fresh-pressed uniform, the look of someone who didn't yet understand that bravery and survival were two very different skills. 3 months had passed since Yemen. The days had slowed but never really stopped. Her reassignment to Coronado was meant to be temporary administrative duty, a soft landing after the mission that had taken Hayes. She hated the word temporary. It always meant waiting for someone else to decide when you were ready again. She spent her mornings running the obstacle course before sunrise, alone. Midday, she sat in the small classroom near the dive tower, teaching situational awareness and decision-making to new candidates. They didn't know her story, not fully. Rumors, maybe, the woman who'd earned the trident, the one who'd fought off 5 recruits in the mess hall, the one who'd walked out of Yemen without a scratch while others didn't. They watched her like she was a legend. She wished they wouldn't. That afternoon, as the sun hammered down on the asphalt, a young recruit stumbled during a timed gear drill. His rifle clattered to the ground. The others laughed under their breath. Bryn stopped the clock. "Pick it up," she said evenly. He did, face flushed, breathing hard. "Again." He blinked. "Ma'am, I." "Again." He reset his gear, trembling fingers fumbling with the straps. He finished 10 seconds faster this time. "Better," she said. "You dropped your weapon once, don't drop it again. Not here, not anywhere." She turned to the rest. "Anyone want to tell me why I made him repeat it?" Silence. Finally someone mumbled, "Discipline, ma'am." She shook her head. "Respect, for the job, for the people who might be standing next to you when it matters. You get one mistake, the second one costs someone else." The laughter was gone now. They stood straighter. When the drill ended, the same recruit approached her, still catching his breath. "Ma'am," he said, "were you really there, in Yemen?" Bryn studied his face, barely 20, eager, uncertain. "That's what they tell me." He nodded awkwardly. "I just wanted to say, I hope I can handle things like that someday." She looked at him for a long moment. "If you're lucky," she said quietly, "you'll never have to." That night she walked along the shoreline, boots sinking into wet sand. The Pacific roared, endless and alive. She thought about the faces she'd seen fade, teammates, friends, and one kid who'd believed she could keep him safe. She had promised herself she'd keep walking, but walking toward what? The question followed her into sleep. 2 weeks later the answer came, wrapped in classified orders, and a name she hadn't heard in a long time. Operation Glass Tide. A joint tasking under Naval Special Warfare Group 1. Objective: extract a defecting foreign intelligence officer with knowledge of planned maritime attacks. High risk, politically sensitive, minimal footprint. The mission lead, Lieutenant Bryn Takakota. When she read the orders, her stomach tightened. Leadership. Again. She wanted at once the chance to shape a mission, to be the one responsible. Now it felt heavier than it used to. Responsibility had faces attached. Ramirez stopped by her quarters that evening, travel bag slung over his shoulder. "Heard you got the call," he said. She nodded. "You coming?" He shook his head. "Not this one. Command thinks I've had enough of deserts for a while." A small smile tugged at her mouth. "Lucky you." He looked at her seriously. "You've earned this, Bryn. Just remember, command doesn't mean carrying it alone." She almost laughed. "That's the only way I know how." The team deployed under the cover of civilian contractors, landing in Crete before moving by sea toward the operation zone, the Gulf of Aden. The target was a defector named Samir Khalil, a mid-level operative who'd signaled a desire to cooperate with U.S. intelligence. He was hiding in a fishing village controlled by a militant faction. Extraction would require stealth, no gunfights, no footprints. For 3 days, they prepped aboard a small logistics vessel. The crew trusted her now, men who'd fought beside her or heard stories from those who had. They didn't question her quiet. They'd learned that when she spoke, it mattered. The night before insertion, Bryn stood alone on the deck, staring at the black water. The sea was calm, deceptively gentle. Chief Howard, her second-in-command, joined her. "Weather's good," he said. "Could be worse." "It's always worse," she said softly. He chuckled. "Fair point." They were quiet for a while. Then he said, "I read Hayes' file. He was one of ours before I transferred." Bryn didn't respond. Howard continued, "I just wanted you to know people still talk about how you tried to pull him out. Word gets around." She swallowed. "People like stories that end neatly. That one doesn't." "Maybe not," he said, "but it's still one worth telling." She didn't know what to do with that, so she just nodded and looked back at the waves. The insertion began an hour before dawn. A rigid inflatable boat skimmed across the black surface, its engine barely above a whisper. Bryn led the team, 6 operators, all shadows in the pre-morning gloom. They hit the shore quietly. The village was little more than a cluster of huts and a half-collapsed pier. Dogs barked somewhere inland. A generator hummed faintly. Through her NVGs, she could see movement inside one of the larger buildings. 2 guards, no more. They advanced in silence, rifles low, steps light. Every second stretched thin. Inside the structure, a man waited, late 40s, nervous, clutching a small satchel. Samir Khalil. Bryn switched to English. "We're here to get you out. You move when I say move." He nodded, eyes wide. They were halfway to the extraction point when the first shot cracked. A bullet hissed past her shoulder, sparking against a rock, then another. "Ambush East Ridge." She dove for cover, returning fire. The village erupted, shouts in Arabic, gunfire echoing between walls. "Contact close," Howard yelled. Bryn grabbed Kahlo by the collar, pulling him behind a crate. "Stay down." She keyed her mic. "Team 2 status. 2 wounded, pinned near the pier." Her mind raced. The exfil boat was still 500 meters offshore. "Howard, get the wounded moving. I'll hold here." He hesitated. "That's suicide, ma'am." "Not if you hurry." She switched to single fire, methodical, controlled. The rhythm steadied her heartbeat, every squeeze deliberate, every target accounted for. Minutes blurred into seconds. She felt the impact before she heard it, a burning line grazing her shoulder. She dropped behind cover, biting back a curse. "Lieutenant, you're hit," Howard's voice through comms. "Just a scratch, keep moving." Finally, she saw the signal, 2 red strobes flashing near the water. The boat. She turned to Khalil. "Go now." He ran, stumbling but alive. She covered the retreat, firing until her magazine clicked empty. Then she grabbed a smoke canister from her belt, pulled the pin, and threw it toward the ridge. A curtain of white erupted, swallowing the night. By the time she reached the shoreline, the others were already hauling the wounded into the boat. Howard turned, reaching for her. "Come on, Lieutenant." She sprinted the last 20 meters, boots splashing through surf. The engine roared to life, and they sped away just as rounds tore into the water behind them. When the coast finally disappeared, she let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. Hours later, back on the vessel, medics tended to the wounded. One man had taken a round through the leg, The other was concussed but stable. Kahlo sat nearby, clutching his satchel like a lifeline. Bryn's shoulder throbbed, but she waved off treatment. She stood near the railing, watching the horizon shift from black to gold. Howard approached quietly. "You disobeyed direct extraction protocol," he said. She glanced at him. "I followed the right one." He smirked. "The moral one, huh?" She didn't answer. He studied her for a moment. "Command won't like it, but they'll call it a success anyway. They always do." She nodded faintly. "Success doesn't feel like much anymore." Howard leaned on the rail beside her. "You ever think about what comes after all this, when it's over?" She looked out at the endless water. "I used to think there'd be a version of me who didn't need this, someone quiet, normal, but maybe that's not how some of us are built." He didn't argue. The sun climbed higher, turning the waves into glass. She thought of the recruits back in Coronado, the kid who'd dropped his rifle, the ones who still believed in glory. Maybe her purpose wasn't escaping this life. Maybe it was teaching others how to survive it. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the wind sting her face. Sometimes strength wasn't loud or visible. Sometimes it was just choosing to stand where others wouldn't, and staying there long enough to make a difference. When they returned to base a week later, the debrief was short, the commendations inevitable. Successful extraction, minimal casualties, no intelligence compromise. Bryn filed the paperwork, gave her statement, and walked out before the applause could start. Outside, the air smelled of salt and rain. She watched the sky darken over the bay, thinking of everything they'd lost and everything they'd carried home. For the first time, she didn't feel like she was running from silence. She was learning to live inside it. And maybe, just maybe, to teach others how. Why did coming home feel harder than leaving ever had? The Pacific glittered the same way it always had, but everything around it seemed smaller now, quieter, dulled by routine and fluorescent light. Lieutenant Bryn Takakota stood at the edge of the SEAL compound in Coronado, watching morning drills play out on the grinder. The cadence calls, the wet sand, the sharp smell of brine, it should have felt familiar. Instead, it felt like memory wearing somebody else's uniform. She was an instructor now, officially senior liaison for advanced candidate integration. Unofficially, the Navy's experiment, its proof that a woman who'd fought and bled alongside men could teach the next generation how not to lose themselves. It had sounded simple when command pitched it: teach, mentor, shape the future. But the first day she stepped into that classroom, 34 recruits turned and froze like someone had cut the power. She could read the questions in their faces before anyone spoke. Is she really one of us, or just here to prove a point? She didn't answer them with speeches. She just handed out training schedules and said, "We start at 05. Bring what's real, leave what is." By the third week, half of them had stopped doubting. The rest still whispered when they thought she couldn't hear. She let them. Whispers didn't kill anyone. Arrogance did. That morning's evolution was underwater navigation. Cold, murky. The kind of exercise that stripped people down to their nerves. She watched through the surface glare as two candidates surfaced off course, coughing. One cursed into his regulator, the other ripped off his mask, panic blooming across his face. Bryn was in the water before anyone else moved. She glided toward him, calm, deliberate, the way her grandfather had moved through the woods, slow enough to steady whatever was breaking. She took the kid's arm, guiding his breathing until the panic turned back into oxygen. When they reached shore, he muttered, "I'm sorry, ma'am. I lost the line." She shook her head. "You didn't lose it, you stopped trusting it." He frowned. "The ocean doesn't care how strong you are," she said quietly. "It only listens to people who keep breathing." Later, one of the other instructors pulled her aside. A tall, blunt-spoken chief who'd been in since before women were allowed in the pipeline. "You handle them different," he said. "Not accusation, just observation." "Different how?" You talk before you shout. She met his gaze. They'll get shouted at plenty. I'm here to make sure they listen before they break. He grunted, thinking it over. Maybe that's what they've been missing. Evenings were harder. The base went still after sunset, the air thick with the smell of salt and machine oil. She'd sit on the dock with a thermos of black coffee, watching small craft move across the water. The quiet felt less like peace and more like absence. Sometimes she caught herself glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see Hayes walking toward her with that crooked grin. Sometimes she thought she heard her grandfather's voice in the wind. The grief wasn't sharp anymore. It was something slower, steadier, like a weight she'd learned to balance. One night Chief Howard, her second from Glass Tide, showed up at the dock carrying 2 beers. Command signed off on the final report, he said. They called it flawless. Bryn snorted softly. Flawless doesn't bleed. He sat beside her. You know, for someone who hates attention, you've become a legend again. They're saying your recruits are performing 20% above baseline. She shrugged. Numbers don't measure who'll stand their ground when it counts. He took a long sip, then said, maybe you should write it down, what you've learned for the next ones. She looked out at the black water. Maybe I already am. 2 months later, the new class began. Among them was a woman, one of 3 cleared for assessment. Her name was Kayla Bennett, 23, lean, sharp-eyed, with the same defiance Bryn remembered seeing in her own reflection years ago. From day one, Kayla was fire, fast, fierce, sometimes reckless. Bryn saw both promise and danger. Determination could carry you through pain. It could also blind you to everything else. During a live-fire simulation, Kayla pushed too far ahead, breaking formation to chase a target. The instructors called halt. Bryn met her at the line. What happened back there? I saw the opening, ma'am. You saw an illusion. You left your teammate uncovered. Kayla's jaw set. He hesitated. Bryn stepped closer. Then your job is to make sure he moves, not abandon him. Out there, lone heroes die first. The younger woman's glare softened a little. You ever been scared? Bryn didn't hesitate. Every time. The trick isn't pretending you're not, it's learning what to do with it. That night Bryn stayed late reviewing performance logs. When she finally left, she found Kayla waiting outside. I read about you, Kayla said. Syria, Yemen, they say you saved a whole team. Bryn sighed. Don't believe stories that skip the messy parts. What about the mess hall thing? That one's true, she said, faintly smiling, but not the part people remember. What part that? Bryn looked past her toward the quiet ocean. The silence after, the part where you realize winning a fight doesn't change how people see you, it just changes who avoids your table. Kayla didn't know what to say. Bryn didn't wait for her to find words. Get some sleep, candidate. Tomorrow's surf torture. You'll need your lungs. Weeks blurred into a rhythm. Recruits cycled through exhaustion and discovery. Some quit, some surprised her. Kayla didn't quit. One evening, after a particularly brutal evolution, Bryn watched her sit alone by the boat shed, hands shaking from cold. The other candidates had gone for chow. Bryn walked over, handing her a towel. You'll freeze before you dry, she said. Kayla managed a grin. Figured cold builds character. Cold builds pneumonia, Bryn replied. Character comes later. They sat in silence for a while. Then Kayla said quietly, I heard what happened to your teammate, in Yemen. Bryn's chest tightened. That story shouldn't be floating around. I'm sorry, Kayla said quickly. I didn't mean. It's fine. Bryn stared at the dark water. He was good, better than most. Sometimes being good isn't enough. Kayla hesitated. Does it get easier? Bryn shook her head. No, you just learn how to keep breathing through it. Kayla nodded slowly, eyes glistening from cold or something deeper. I want to be like you someday. Bryn almost smiled. Don't be better. 3 months later, graduation loomed. Only 9 remained from the original 34. Kayla was among them. Bryn watched the ceremony from the edge of the grinder, hands clasped behind her back as each candidate received the trident pin. When it was Kayla's turn, she looked out into the crowd and found Bryn. For a heartbeat, their eyes met. Bryn gave a single nod, nothing more. After the formation dismissed, Kayla approached. "I wanted to say thank you," she said. "For what?" "For not going easy on me." Bryn studied her face, sunburned and proud. "The world won't go easy on you either. You did this yourself." Kayla smiled. "You ever think about what comes next for you?" Bryn exhaled softly. "Every day." Kayla hesitated, then reached into her pocket and pulled out a small object, a flattened shell from the beach. "Found it during night navigation. Kept it as a reminder that calm water hides currents. Thought you might like it." Bryn took it carefully, feeling its smooth surface. "You learn fast." Kayla shrugged. "Good teachers." They shook hands. Then Kayla walked away toward her waiting team, laughter echoing faintly across the lot. Bryn stood there a long time, the shell warm in her palm. Later that night, she returned to the dock. The sky was clear, stars sharp against the black. She turned the shell over between her fingers, then looked down at the reflection of her face in the water. She thought of every version of herself: the recruit, the operator, the survivor, the mentor. None of them had vanished. They just folded into one another like layers of tide. Behind her, the sound of footsteps. It was Chief Moss, older now, slower, but still carrying that quiet authority. "Heard your class set a record," he said. "Lowest dropout rate in 10 years. She smiled faintly. "Guess yelling isn't everything." He chuckled. "You've changed the way we train, you know. People notice." She looked back at the sea. "That's not what I was trying to do." "Doesn't matter, you did." Moss watched her for a moment. "You planning to stay?" "I don't know," she said honestly. "Part of me still itches when I hear the word deployment. Another part finally likes waking up without sand in my teeth." He nodded. "You've earned the right to choose." She smiled, quiet, tired. "Maybe that's the real victory." He clapped her shoulder gently. "Keep teaching, Lieutenant. The Navy can make operators. You're making warriors." When he left, she stayed on the dock until the horizon started to glow with dawn. She held the shell one last time, then placed it beside her grandfather's dog tag on the bench. 2 tokens from 2 different worlds, one forged in war, one found in peace. For the first time in years, she felt both belonged to her. The wind rose, carrying the faint sound of morning drills starting again. She whispered to the empty air, half prayer, half promise. "Sometimes strength isn't the fight, it's knowing when to stop swinging." The sun broke the horizon, light spilling across the bay. Bryn closed her eyes and let it touch her face, breathing in, steady, alive. Why did peace feel heavier than war? Bryn Takakota used to think calm was supposed to be light, something you earned after all the noise stopped. But now, walking across the Coronado Pier at dusk, she knew better. Peace had weight. It pressed against your chest the same way armor once did. Maybe because real peace wasn't the absence of battle, it was the choice not to go looking for one. The base had changed in small ways. New recruits, new instructors, the same smell of salt and fuel clinging to the wind. She passed the grinder where Kayla's class had trained months ago, new candidates now shouting cadence under the setting sun. The rhythm of it stirred something deep and familiar in her blood. She stopped listening. For a moment she could almost feel the sand again, the sting of salt in her eyes, her grandfather's voice in the back of her mind. "Don't rush the shot, Bryn. Let the world come to you." She smiled, still learning that one, Granddad. 3 months had passed since Kayla's graduation. Bryn had settled into instruction, her days a mixture of training, paperwork, and quiet counsel. She, grown used to the balance, half soldier, half teacher. For the first time, she'd allowed herself to think maybe this was enough. Then the email came. Subject, Inquiry, Field Advisory Support, East Africa. It wasn't an order, not yet. Just a request for temporary assessment from Joint Special Operations Command. A short deployment, attached as a tactical advisor. Minimal risk, they said. She stared at the screen for a long time. Her pulse didn't spike, it slowed. That was how she knew it mattered. That night she walked to the shore. The ocean was dark, alive, whispering things she'd tried to forget. She thought of Hayes, of Ramirez, of all the faces that never came home. And she thought of Kayla, somewhere out there now, young, unbroken, trying to prove herself to a world that still didn't quite know what to do with women like them. Bryn closed her eyes. For years she'd let the job define her. Maybe it still did. But this time she wanted the reason to be different. When she opened her eyes, the horizon glowed faintly gold. Decision made. The deployment was small. Ethiopia, officially humanitarian liaison, unofficially security support for naval convoys moving through the Gulf. When she arrived at the forward site, a rough camp tucked between dust and mountains, she was surprised at the stillness. No firefights, no screaming radios, just the hum of generators and the chatter of aid workers trying to keep the logistics straight. The commanding officer, Captain Laird, greeted her with a handshake that felt too warm for the environment. "We're lucky to have you, Lieutenant," he said. "Things here are stable but delicate." She nodded. They always are. Her task was simple: assess local defense training and ensure convoy safety. But on her second week, the simplicity cracked. A convoy checkpoint 20 kilometers north was attacked, brief, violent, over before support could respond. 2 locals wounded, 1 American contractor dead. The attackers melted back into the hills. That night Bryn joined the response briefing. Laird's team wanted immediate retaliation, track the suspects, send a drone, show strength. Bryn sat in the corner listening. When they finished, she spoke quietly. "What about the civilians near that village?" A junior officer shrugged. "Collateral risk is low." She stared at him until he looked away. "Low isn't zero." Laird frowned. "Lieutenant, with respect, hesitation sends the wrong message. They need to know we'll respond." Bryn leaned forward. "You don't teach restraint by burning down the house. You teach it by knocking on the door." Silence. The kind of silence that followed her wherever she went. The weight of someone challenging what everyone else was ready to justify. Finally, Laird exhaled. "You're suggesting negotiation." "Information first," she said. "Patience buys clarity. You taught me that once," she added softly, though the man she was really quoting was buried in Washington soil. He studied her for a moment, then he nodded. "You have 48 hours." The next 2 days blurred into motion. Bryn worked with local scouts, tracking movement through the dry canyons. The heat was brutal, shimmering off the rocks like a threat. On the second night, they found what they were looking for. Not a militant camp, but a cluster of families who'd fled the region weeks earlier. Among them was a boy no older than 10, arm bandaged, face streaked with dust. Through the interpreter, Bryn learned he'd been caught in the crossfire at the checkpoint. His father had died trying to pull him away. She crouched beside him, offering her canteen. He stared at her uniform, eyes wide. She wondered what he saw, protector or ghost. When they left, she radioed back to Laird. "Recommend we stand down on the drone strike. The intel's wrong. They're civilians." There was a long pause, then his voice understood. Relief hit her like exhaustion. That night she sat outside her tent, staring at the horizon. For years she'd measured worth in missions completed, lives saved. But maybe the truer measure was the one that left no report behind, the disasters quietly prevented because someone chose to wait. Weeks later, when the deployment ended, she returned to Coronado to find her office buried under training requests. The world kept turning, as it always did. But something inside her had shifted. The next morning, during the weekly candidate orientation, she stood before a fresh class, faces bright, uniforms crisp. She told them none of the stories they expected. No war tales, no heroics, just this. You're going to think toughness means not feeling anything. It doesn't. It means feeling everything and moving anyway. You'll think silence makes you invisible. It doesn't. It makes you forgettable. Don't chase medals. Chase meaning. Because one day, the only person who will know what really happened out there will be you, and you'll have to live with that. No one spoke. Even the air seemed to listen. Then she said, softer, respect isn't loud. It doesn't need applause. It's earned every time you choose to do the right thing when no one's watching. She stepped back, letting the words settle. Some of them would forget by tomorrow, but a few, maybe one, would carry it for life. That was enough. That evening she found an envelope on her desk. No sender. Inside, a photograph, Kayla and her new team, dusty and smiling somewhere in North Africa. On the back, a single line written in pencil. Still breathing. Bryn's throat tightened. She set the photo beside her trident, the shell, and her grandfather's tag. 3 relics, 3 lives, none of them neat, all of them true. She walked to the window. The sun was bleeding into the Pacific again, turning the water to gold. Out there somewhere, more storms waited, more recruits, more choices. She didn't need to chase any of it anymore. The work would find her when it needed to. For now, she stood still and watched the light fade. Later that night, the wind carried the smell of rain across the bay. She walked down to the dock, the same one where everything had begun. The water lapped quietly against the wood. She took off her boots, sat, and let her feet dangle above the surface. For once, she didn't feel the need to fill the silence. She thought about the arc of it all. The girl who'd learned to hunt in the woods of Washington, the candidate who refused to quit, the operator who'd buried too many friends, the woman who'd learned that strength sometimes meant saying no. She thought of her grandfather's lessons, Hayes' trust, Ramirez's calm, Moss's faith, and Kayla's hope. Pieces of a life built on courage that never asked for permission. She whispered, not to anyone in particular, "Thank you for staying with me." The sky answered with thunder somewhere far off. She smiled. It sounded like applause from a distance too great to measure. A week later, she filed her retirement request, effective in 6 months. Not because she was tired of serving, but because she finally understood service didn't end when the uniform came off. When Moss heard, he just nodded. "You'll find another fight," he said. "Maybe I'll find something worth not fighting for," she replied. He grinned. "That's harder." "I know," she said. "That's why I'm ready." The day she left Coronado, the air was heavy with fog. She stood by the fence line one last time, watching new recruits run drills in the distance. One of them, young, uncertain, caught her eye and saluted. Bryn returned it, crisp and proud. Then she turned toward the gate. Each step felt lighter. At the edge of the pier, she paused and looked back. The base gleamed under the morning light, concrete, salt memory. She whispered the words she wished someone had told her years ago. Dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. Then she walked into the sunlight, the sound of the ocean following her like a heartbeat. And for the first time in a very long time, Bryn Takakota felt free.